We are recording the interview of John Wright. This interview is being conducted by Ericka Carter from the Wright State University Veterans Voices Project. This interview is being recorded at the Crowne Plaza in downtown Dayton. It is 3:18 p.m. on July 12, 2019. Hi, John.
Hi.
How are you feeling today?
I'm feeling fine.
Wonderful, wonderful. When and where were you born?
I was born in California, Pennsylvania, October 25th, 1925. We lived on my grandfather's dairy farm. Grandfather, his name was Gillis, Lindsay Gillis, and my father he was born in 1898, and his name was William Dewey Wright, and they got the name Dewey because at that time Admiral Dewey had just defeated the Spanish in the Spanish-American War, and Dewey was a regular popular name then, so my grandparents called him William Dewey Wright, and that was in 1898, and my mother was born in 1900. Her name was Maud Elizabeth Gillis, and she lived on a farm there. My grandparents, of course, had a large family. And then, I don't know when they met, but they married in like 1920, 21 or something like that. And I had an older brother. He was born in 1923, and I was born in 1925. But my father died when I was only about 18 months old, so let's see. He died of peritonitis as a result of appendicitis in March of 1928, I guess it was, yeah. Anyway, so then my mother and with my older brother stayed at my grandparents' farm, and my grandmother died, so my mother was the housekeeper. My grandfather and two of his sons were still there operating the farm. And eventually I went to a place called East Pike Run Township High School, which was on the outskirts of California, Pennsylvania, and graduated in 1943. And then at the time I came to Baltimore because my brother was working in Baltimore, the shipyard, and I came down to see if I could find work. And places wouldn't hire me because I had just a few months ago before I'd be 18 and of draft age, and at that time you had to have a 6 months employment in order to apply for a draft deferment. So that meant that even they trained me, then I'd probably be drafted before that time. And so I went back to Pennsylvania and got a job in the steel mill in Menneson, Pennsylvania, which at that time the steel mill they were operating 24 hours a day, and they were looking for anybody that they could employ because so many people were going into the service. And so I got a job there, and in October 25th, I took a day off work to register for the draft. And at that day, the only one in the office was the secretary to the draft board. And she said, are you working now? And I said, yes. She said, well, what'd you do, take a day off? And then she said, why don't you get your first physical today and you won't have to lose any more time. She said, I'll give you your papers, you can go to your family doctor and get a physical. I said, okay. So I went to the family doctor and I handed him the papers. He said, what's this? And I told him, he said, did you volunteer? And I said, no. He said, well, I can hold this off for a while if you want me to. I said, well, all the guys I went to high school with were in the service anyway, so I might as well go. He said, okay, it's your call. So then, that was in October 25th, and in November, I was called in for a second physical and sworn in, and it was November 21st. And then in December, I went on active duty at Fort Meade, Maryland on the 21st of December, and then I got a weekend pass for Christmas and the holidays, Christmas and New Year's, after only 3 or 4 years in the Army, 3 or 4 days rather. So then when I went back to Fort Meade, we were interviewed as to what they were going to do with us, and the man interviewing me said, how would you like to fly for the United States Army Air Corps? I said, that sounds good to me. He said, well, come with me. So at that time, most of the men that I had been drafted with were going to the infantry. I was glad that I wasn't going to the infantry. So I stayed there a few weeks, 3 weeks, I guess, till we got a trainload of people to go to basic training. And then we went to Miami Beach, Florida, for basic training. And we lived in the hotels down there. And my first hotel was the Blackstone Hotel on the 8th floor. And we weren't allowed to use the elevators, so we had to use the stairs at all times. And then shortly after that, I went to another hotel. And when I was finished with basic training, we were sent to Scottsfield, Illinois, for radio school. And that was went there in March until I guess in October. And then in October, I went to radar school. At that time, they were taking 10 people from each graduating class of radio school to go to radar school. I didn't know what radar was, but it was interesting to me. So they sent me to Boca Raton, Florida, for radar school. It was only 5 weeks. And then I was on a 15-day delay of absence to go to, went to Kearns, Utah. And then from Kearns, Utah, we went to Camp Stone in California. And there we got on a troop ship to go to the Pacific. And we were on that troop ship for 30 days until we got to, we ended up in Leyte, Tacloban, which is a town in Leyte Island in the Philippines. And then from there, those of us, it was only 10 or 12 of us on the Air Corps, we were flown back to New Guinea, which we had left 5 days later. And that was where they had they called it a combat training base for Army Air Corps personnel. So we were there a few weeks. And then I was assigned to the 424th Squadron of the 13th Air Force. And that day when we got there, I was picked up at the airstrip on Morotai, which was a small island in the Pacific there. And when we went back to the camping area, I was the only one going to 424th, and the truck driver stopped in front of a tent, and he said, that's the operations office in there for 424th. So I went in and handed my orders to the officer there, and he looked them over and he said, radio, radar, where'd you go to gunnery school? I said, I didn't go to gunnery school. Oh, he said, you didn't? We'll take care of that. So then he saw a man walk by the tent who he knew was a gunner, and he called him in and he said, go to Ordnance and get a 50 caliber machine gun and show this man how to field strip it and clean it and assemble it. So we spent maybe an hour or so under a coconut tree working on that. And we went in, and he said to the officer, he said, "He's okay." He said, "That's fine." So then they sent me to the orderly room and 424th, and the guy said, "Oh, you're our replacement?" He said, "Go over to supply tent, you put it out where it was, and pick up a cot and find a spot in one of these tents where you can set up your cot and let us know which tent you're in." So I found a cot, a spot for my cot, and then went to the mess hall to get something to eat. And I got acquainted with a couple of guys there, and one of the guys said, where are you staying?" And I told him. He said, "We have room in our tent, why don't you come with us?" So here I was glad I went, because they had built a wood floor in their tent, and they had an overhead storage area, and they had places, individual hangers and all that. The cot that I got was great, because the guy had left it, had taken the canvas off and put rubber bands which he cut off with an airplane inner tube, and then put the canvas back on and put a mat on top of that. Then I had an air mattress on that. So I had the most comfortable bed in the area. So getting along a little further, I wasn't assigned to a crew, because our squadron only had 2 radar planes, and I was a radar observer. And we were assigned, there was one other radar observer. We were assigned to the radar plane. Whenever they needed a radar plane, they would send a crew with that, and one of us operators. And so anyway, the first time out was over Davao City in southern Mindanao in the Philippines. And pilot didn't say anything, and I didn't say anything, and I just operated radar. And the next time out, the pilot, see, when we went to the airstrip to get in the planes, the enlisted men went in one truck, and the pilots went in a Jeep, so they could talk over things, I guess, about navigation on the way down. And so then when we got down there, the pilot said to the radio man, he said, "You stay on the radio today. Let the radar man take that waist gun." And because he didn't know that I didn't go to gunnery school, and I didn't tell him, because I'm going up in the air then, it was a little too late. So we were out about 3 or 4 hours, and the pilot said, "Okay, get your gun set up and test fire." And I said to the guy in the other gun, I said, "How do you set this thing up?" He said, "Didn't you go to gunnery school?" And I said, "No." So he showed me how to hook it up, and that was my gunnery training. But I still spent most of the time on the radar. At that time, my position was above the bomb bay, and the radar antenna was near the nose wheel. So I had to go through the bomb bay to the nose wheel to let down the antenna, and then go back through the bomb bay up to the top of the, and I had a compartment there about maybe 3 feet high, because I couldn't sit in there, you know, I sit on the floor and operate it. And the way they were set up then, they were used for both sea search and navigation. And the navigator was up in the nose of the plane, and he had a scope there where he could observe anything on the radar. So he would let me know what range he wanted if he was going to navigate with the radar. And we had a range, I guess it was from 50 mile to 150 to 300 mile range on the scope. And he would, when he picked up the signal, you know, he'd tell me what he wanted, and also. So that's the way we operated at that time. And then the main job was we would fly up and down a large area of the Pacific looking for Japanese ships, mainly tanker ships, bringing gasoline and oil from Balikpapan and Borneo, the oil fields there. Many people have heard about the Palesti oil fields in Romania that the Germans used, but they never heard much about the Balikpapan oil fields, which the Japanese had taken over. So we were after the ships that was carrying that gasoline and oil. And we were flying out of the island of Morotai, which is probably, as far as I know, it's about 3 miles wide and about 10 miles long. And we still had several thousand, I wouldn't say several, 2,000 Japanese troops on the island, with an infantry company keeping them up in the hills while we had the only lowland for our airstrips and beaches. And then one thing that they did to try to fool the Japanese, that there were some caves in the mountains, and the Japanese had some heavy guns. They moved into the caves, and occasionally they'd come out and fire at the guns when the planes were taking off. So in order to trap them, the Navy would fly. They were patrolling the area 24 hours a day on PT boats, like Kennedy's PT-109, and so they would come out and shoot at our planes, but the PT boats would go out as a decoy, and the guns would shoot at them also. And there would be a couple of small airplanes flying overhead, and when they saw where the flash was coming from the caves, then they told the other fighter pilots, P-38 pilots, and they would strike them. And that's how they got rid of the heavy guns that were left in the mountains. And the thing was, the Japanese at that time couldn't get any supplies in there, including food. They would plant rice paddies, and we would fly photo observance, and when the paddies were ready to harvest, then they would send a bomber over with, or a fighter plane with a bomb of a 50-gallon drum of gasoline and oil with a detonator on it, and drop it on, and they would spray over the rice and kill the rice. So the Japanese ended up eating what they could off the coconut trees and maybe a few banana trees and pineapple trees, and fish that they might be able to catch in the area there. So then, anyway, we had, there was two radar operators and 2 radar planes in the 424th Squadron. So as I said, we flew with the crews. We were never assigned to a crew, but we flew, we were assigned to the plane. And excuse me. And we used the radar for navigation when the weather was bad and it was overcast. And also we used it for sea search. We could pick up pips, we call them, on the scope that indicated that we were picking up a ship. You know, the way radar works, it transmits a high frequency radio wave, which is reflected back, and you have an antenna that picks up that reflection, and that puts a picture on the scope as to where you are and what you're doing. We could pick the coastal areas of islands and all that, and you could actually compare that with the pictures on the maps and tell where you were if you didn't have got it sort of out of range. But anyway, well, we would go to Balikpapan, which was a long mission. Some of them were as much as 17 hours in the air. And at that time, they were all B-24s, and the B-24 had 4 bomb bays, 2 forward, 2 rear, and we'd carry 2 400-gallon tanks of gasoline in the forward bomb bay, which was hooked up to the wing tanks. So when the wing tanks started to get low in gasoline, we could pump it into the wing tanks and keep in the air that much longer. And so sometimes we'd be up much longer. And of course, at that time, this was towards the end of the war. They didn't have many planes there. They had planes, would say that, but their runways were pretty much bombed out, because that's one of our jobs, was to bomb out the runways so they couldn't get their planes in the air. And then we'd observe when they were repairing the runways when they got them just about ready to use, would bomb them out again. And so then when we got near Balikpapan, we had to go to high altitude to get over an aircraft fire. We didn't have any fighter planes then, but the anti-aircraft fire was still pretty fierce. And so that's why we didn't go down. And you didn't go much more than 10,000 feet, because at 10,000 feet you had to take on oxygen. And we didn't have a great supply of oxygen. So after 10,000 feet, we'd have to wear an oxygen mask and hook it up to an oxygen tank that was nearby. And so we didn't stay up any longer than necessary to get down where we didn't have to take oxygen. And it was a little warmer, as it got very cold at high altitude. Still does, but anyway, then we would, on the way back, we would, you know, just observe certain things, and usually didn't have much to do but to get back, because we're running low on gas. And there's one interesting story about, supposedly one of our planes was coming back from a mission, and a Japanese plane pulled up alongside, and he picked up the intercom frequency of our plane and said, "You guys must be out of ammunition, or you're going to shut me down." And the pilot, the bomber pilot, said, "What about you?" He said, "I don't have anything either." And you know, they're both out of gas. And he said to the Japanese pilot, he said, "How could you speak English so well?" And he said he was born in Japan in the early 20s, and his family moved almost immediately to San Francisco. So he was born and raised in San Francisco. And in 1940, the family went back to Japan for a visit, and that's when he got drafted into the Japanese Air Force. And that's why he was. And an interesting thing is, then he said, "Well, I'm getting low on gas. I better get back. I'll see you guys tomorrow. You'll be shooting at me, and I'll be shooting at you. Have a good day." And he left it. But that's a sideline that you don't hear too often, but makes a good story anyway. And so, anyway, then we didn't have much opposition on the island of Mordai, because, as I said, they couldn't get any supplies, but they still had several troops up in the hills there. And but another interesting thing there, that there were one day, as I said, there was a Navy around there, PT boats and so forth. And one day there was a Japanese hospital ship in the area, and the American Navy got suspicious of it and sent a boarding party aboard. Of course, the Japanese didn't object to it, because this was a hospital ship painted white with a red cross on it, just like all other hospital ships, which are supposedly, according to international law, go anywhere to refuel or repair whatever they need. So they sent this boarding party, and the officer in charge of the boarding party said, "If you don't hear from me in 30 minutes, open fire on them." He said, "Because you know, we know something's wrong." So when they got aboard, he sent some of his boarding party to the engine room almost immediately to make sure they didn't sabotage the ship. And then they found out that they had 1,700 combat troops on the ship in pajamas, and all their medical supply boxes were filled with guns and ammunition. And they took command of the ship right away and brought more crewmen over to bring the ship back to harbor at Mordai. And they had to keep it up in harbor for 3 days while the engineers built a compound large enough to put these prisoners in, because at that time they were prisoners of war. They weren't hospital patients. And so that the day they unloaded, a group of us were working on an airplane at the airstrip, and we were on our way back to the tent area for chow. And a convoy came by with several trucks. Each truck had about 15 or 20 Japanese troops on them. And they had pajamas on over top their field uniforms. And we could see their field uniforms. And then at the time we had Australians and Indian troops on the island too, you know, because the Australians had a few airplanes there too. But anyway, they unloaded them there on Mordai. And they were still there, of course, when the war was over. Another interesting thing on the land there is when the war was over and the Japanese were signing the surrender terms in Tokyo Bay, at that time the Australians were in charge of the part of the Pacific where we were, South Pacific. And so the Japanese command in that area had to come into Mordai to surrender to the Australians. And they came in and they had the 3 bombers they brought in. They had to be painted white with green crosses on them. And so they landed there, and the crews stayed with the planes. And they, of course, the officers and the interpreters went to the Australian headquarters to go through the ceremony and sign the surrender terms. And of course, we were able to get on the airstrip, and we were right underneath the planes with the Japanese crews. And we were in a face-to-face with them, but of course, we couldn't speak Japanese. They could. They couldn't speak to us. Of course, the interpreters were with the officers going through the surrender. So anyway, then after that, they went back to wherever they'd come from. And then, see, unfortunately, there was a false alarm one night before the actual atomic bomb was dropped. Then the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and that's when the Japanese surrendered. And so there was actually one plane that was actually shot down, one American plane. It wasn't shot down, but it was shot at, and one American crew member was killed. He was the last officially casualty or fatality in World War II. Was 2 or 3 days after the surrender terms had been signed, because they didn't know it. They hadn't caught the word. And so the Japanese plane shot at them, or whether it was planes or an aircraft fire, we don't know. But that killed one of the crew, and he was actually the last official fatality in World War II, killed 2 days after the end of the war, after the peace treaty was signed. And then we started to move up to Clark Field at that time, near Manila in the Philippine Islands. And several of us, well, they were sending a few crews at a time, and as each crew left, they had to take down their tent and clean their area and pack everything up and take it with them to go to Clark Field. And since I wasn't assigned to a crew, then I was one of the few that finished up the last couple of days of cleanup and went up to Clark Field. And when we got to Clark Field, after a few days, a few of us decided we wanted to go out and play a little game of touch football. So we were in a rice paddy, and I stepped in a hole and broke my left femur. Just snapped it in half. It looked like I had 2 knees in that left leg because it's bent back that way and so forth. And anyway, at that time, we were bringing our planes back to the States, and each plane would have a regular crew, and plus maybe whatever, 3 or 4 extra men that they could carry in the bomber, bringing them back to the States. And we came back point system. By that time, they had a point system for drafting, which meant you got a point for every time, every month in the service, an extra point for time overseas, an extra point for combat area, and all that sort of thing, you know. So, but you had to have a minimum of 75 points to be eligible for discharge. And we had ground crew men who had been over there for almost 3 years. So some of them had well over 100 points. And that meant that we lost many of our experienced crew members all at one time. And we had new crew members coming over. And even though they had graduated from a training school and so forth, there's still a lot of things you learn on the job that you don't get in school. So we lost a few planes unnecessarily then through mechanical failure, simply because we didn't have the experienced crews. But anyway, since I had been supposed to be on that plane, I was in the hospital, so somebody else was assigned in my place. And I found out a few days later when I was in the hospital that that plane had taken off from Clarkfield, went to Guam, landed in Guam to refuel. And after refueling, they were taking off, and they hit a mountain or a treetop or something and crashed and killed everybody on the plane. So if I hadn't had a broken leg, I'd have been on the plane. But then a few weeks later, I came back on a hospital plane with a fractured femur. And so that meant I spent a few more months in the Army than I might have normally spent if I hadn't broken my leg or hadn't been killed in a crash. And so it took us a few days to get back to the States because we'd stop and stay overnight at a different location because they didn't want the hospital planes flying at night because
you can't see them. You don't know.
Have 20 or 25 patients on the plane. They're all tied down, and there's no way you can get out. And you're better off in daylight so you can see what you're doing. But anyway, so it took us a while to get back to Hamilton Field in California, just outside of San Francisco. And we spent a few days in Hamilton Field, and then we started back to, I was supposed to go to Pittsburgh, because California was, my hometown was just a few miles, maybe 35 miles from Pittsburgh. So when we stopped 2 or 3 places again overnight, and then dropped a few here and there. And it happened to be Christmas Eve in 1945, after dark, that we landed in Pittsburgh. And I was the only one to get off the plane in Pittsburgh. So they brought me off on a litter, and I had a blanket on me. And the guy on the plane, one of the men on the plane, grabbed the blanket. And they said, "What are you going to do? What are you doing with that?" He said, "That's my blanket. That's on my inventory. You get your own blankets." So there I am. It's cold. The wind is blowing. It's after dark, and I'm on a cot. I'm in a litter with a cast from my underarms up to the end of my left foot, and halfway down to my knee on the right leg, and that's all I had. And so the guy in the ambulance, guy from the tent, the hospital tent that's set up there temporarily, he put a blanket on me and took me into his place. And then he said, we called the hospital, and they're sending the ambulance down to pick you up. And Butler, the hospital was called the Shawn Military Hospital in Butler, Pennsylvania. And so after a while, they got down there, and when they loaded me on their ambulance, the attendant said, "What are you doing with that blanket?" And he said, "That's my blanket. It's on my inventory. Don't you have any?" So they didn't have a blanket on the ambulance. And one guy took his overcoat off and covered me over with the overcoat. They put me in the back of the ambulance and didn't anchor the litter down. So they were going by and they were swinging back and forth. And I think they had stopped to celebrate Christmas Eve before they picked me up. Because one of the guys says, "We're going to get you there, buddy." I said, "Well, wait a minute. Let's get there. I'm in no hurry." I got the rest of the night. But eventually we got to Butler, Pennsylvania. And that was on Christmas Eve, and I was allowed one free phone call. So I called my grandmother, who was back there in California. And the next day, Christmas Day, she came by bus from California, Pennsylvania to Pittsburgh to Butler and all to see me. And I really appreciated that because that was the first family member I had in touch with, were in touch with him. I like that. So anyway, then I was, after a few days there, they cut the cast off my leg and put a brace on it from my hip all the way down to the end of my foot. And I was able to walk with crutches. And they gave me a leave for 15 days. And then I had to get back there. And while I was home, my brother, who had been in the Navy, he came home on leave. In fact, he had been discharged and he came home. So I called the hospital and told them the situation and asked if I could have an extension. They said, "Okay, take at least a 5-day extension, because we know where you are. We know you're no good to us with a cast on your foot." So anyway, then I went back to Dishon Hospital, and a few days later, I was given orders to go to Coral Gables Air Force Complex Hospital, Coral Gables, Florida. And so I went down there, and after a few weeks down there, several weeks, then they would come in and examine us at least once a week and decide whether we were ready for discharge or not. So finally the doctor said to me, he says, "Well, you can be discharged if you want." He said, "But you have less than 10% disability, which means you won't be eligible for a pension, medical pension." I said, "Well, that doesn't make it to me. I want to get out." Because I was hoping I could go to college after that. So they eventually discharged me and went back to California. And I went back to the steel mill where I'd worked, and they said, "Well, since you were employed here before you went into service, you can have a job." They weren't hiring anybody. They were taking back the people that had been laid off, that had gone in service. They'd let them work for a few days and lay them off because they didn't need them, but they guaranteed them a job. So anyway, then I decided, that was in April of 1946, and I decided I'd see if I could get in college and go to college in June. Now, California State Teachers College was there in California, and I couldn't afford to go anywhere else, and I had to help support my grandparents, so I stayed there in California and went there, and eventually ended up as being we call them shop teacher, industrial arts. I taught woodworking, and then I was recalled for the Korean War, during the Korean War, because I was in the reserves. And I got down to, I had just gotten married, just got a teaching job, and I went to Langfield, Virginia, and I went through the week's orientation there, and they said, "Well, if you want to go on active duty, we can take you now, but if you want to go back, we can take a discharge." And I had told my wife, we'd just been married a few months, I said, "If I have to go in, we'll make a career out of it. If I don't, I'll come back." And she said, "Okay." So that's what happened. I went back, and I actually had a teaching job for 1 year, and the township where I got the job, they had some plans that didn't work out, so they released me. And then I was working in construction, and then another company, school board hired me for a guy who had been drafted, and I was to teach for him until he got back. So then, in the meantime, my sister-in-law, who was married and had a couple of children, had moved from Virginia up to Baltimore. And she went to a PTA meeting one night. And then the next day she called my wife and she said, tell John they need shop teachers in Baltimore County. And if he's interested, I'll send him an application. So she sent me an application. This was in September of 1950. I graduated from college in May of 1950. No, this was in 52. So I filled in the application, sent it to Baltimore County, and they were desperate for shop teachers because enrollment had increased quite a bit. So anyway, I sent the application back early in October, and then a couple of weeks later, I got a letter to come to Baltimore County on a Saturday for an interview. So I come down on a Saturday, and I got hired, was interviewed, and then a few weeks later, I got a letter saying that I was hired and assigned to Dundalk High School, Baltimore County, beginning like November 21st. And so I resigned up there in Pennsylvania, and the principal said to the school board, why don't you give him a raise, because they're only going to Maryland for higher pay. And at that time, the salary in Pennsylvania had already jumped to almost $2,000 a year. In Maryland, I was going to get $2,200 a year. So anyway, on a Friday, I was in Centerville Borough High School. On Friday, I told them I was going to leave on a Friday, like November 21st or something like that. And the last day on Friday, I got home and my wife and I packed up and we came to Baltimore to stay with my sister-in-law for a couple of days while I started here. And we came down to Baltimore, and I was supposed to report to Dundalk High School on a Monday morning. And I said to my sister-in-law, I said, where is Dundalk High School? She said, I don't know. I said, well, let's see if we can find it. I got to be down there in the morning. So we went for a ride, and we found Dundalk High School. We had an idea where it was, but wasn't sure. So Monday morning, I went down there and went into the office, and the vice principal must have thought I was a parent or something. He said, can I do something for you? I said, yeah, I'd like to know where the shop is. Which shop I'm supposed to teach here today? He said, oh, you're our new shop teacher. Come on, I'll show you where it is. So, and that was on a Monday before Thanksgiving. And of course, I was there for 3 days, and then we had Thanksgiving vacation. And at that time, on payday, the principal got everybody's paycheck, and he came around to you individually and gave your paycheck. And so where I was at that time, I was in a room where another man was teaching mechanical drawing. And he gave him his check, and he looked at me and said, I don't suppose I have anything for you. I said, well, I wasn't expecting it. And after a while, he came back and he said, I got something for you. He had a check for me for 3 days teaching from October. So that was my first payday from teaching. And then at that time, they were opening a new school called Parkville Junior High School, or middle school at the time. And one of the men that was at Dundalk was being transferred there to set up the shop so they could open first of the second semester in February. And that's why I was hired to take his place so he could get up there. And so then I was there about, it was a senior high school. And then 2 years later, they opened what was called North Point Junior High. And all the junior high students were transferred over there. And that man who was teaching woodshop there, he was transferred there, and I was given the high school woodshop job. And I was there for 2 or 3 years, and Kenwood High School was opening, and I left the old Kenwood High School as a, I called it Golden Ring Junior High. So I went up there, and then a couple of years later, Overley High School was opened up, and I went over there, and I finished my teaching career at Overley High School in January in 1981. So that's when I retired from teaching. And of course, I was eligible after 30 years service, and I got a couple years credit for being in the military and all that. So then from then on, I picked up odd jobs, home repairs and all that, for additional money along with my retirement pay. And so by that time we had bought and sold a house in Baltimore City, and then we bought a house on Hess Avenue in Parkville, and that's where we were then when I retired. And we hadn't finished the mortgage payments, but did that after a couple of years. And I don't know if you want me to go any further.
I have a few questions.
Okay.
All right. So were you enlisted or commissioned?
Enlisted. I was
Okay.
tech sergeant.
Okay. What plane did you fly on?
B-24.
The B-24. Okay. Did you have to, when you were drafted,
Yeah.
did you have to take a test when you were drafted, like the ASVAB or anything like that?
I guess we did take a sort of placement test.
And do you know if you placed very high?
Well, yeah, at that time you had to have a score, I think, like 108 or something like that to be eligible for officers training. And I was just a little bit above that area.
Okay, because
I could have been eligible for that, but I wasn't.
I'm wondering how you got into the radio school and then this school and then this
Yeah,
school and then
yeah.
this school. So you had to have been in good grades and the top of your, somewhere near the top of
Actually,
your class.
in radio school, they graduated maybe 200 or 300 a week
Oh, okay.
because we went to school in 3 shifts.
Mm.
But then at the end of that graduation, they'd take 10 men out of that graduation class, 10 top men supposedly, to go to radar school. Because at that time, radar was a very secret thing. In fact, I didn't know what radar was. It sounded interesting to me. So that's why I applied for it.
And did going to radar school give you an additional rank?
Yeah, after that I became a corporal. And then when I was sent overseas, I became a staff sergeant. See, the Army had what they called a tech order, which meant that each MOS, which is Military Occupational Service, had a certain rank. And after you could only jump one at a time.
Mm-hmm.
So after a month, I went from corporal to buck sergeant. Another month later, went to staff sergeant. And then another month, tech sergeant. And that was the highest rank I could get, because they allowed 2 radar operators of a tech sergeant rating each squadron. So when I got to tech sergeant, I couldn't go any higher than that.
Do you know how many hours you flew?
Yeah, combat hours. At that time, you needed at least 100 combat hours or 10 missions to get an air medal. And so when the war was over, I had 91 hours and 50 minutes and 9 missions. So then they cut a special order that anybody with 9 missions or 90 hours could get an air medal. See what had happened before that. After 10 missions, you could get an air medal, and after 25 missions, you got the DFC, Distinguished Flying Cross, and then you could continue getting air medals, or you got for each additional award of that medal, you got a silver star that could be attached to your ribbon, indicating you had 2 of those. And the same if you're in 2 combat areas, there'd be an oak leaf cluster added to that particular ribbon if you were there over a period of time. So,
And how long were you there exactly?
in the service,
No, in combat.
well, that started in, I guess my first mission was in early April 1945 until the war was over, which was in, it was August of 45 when the war ended, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was, yeah. Okay.
When you see, oh, how old were you? That was going to be how old were you at that time? Math?
19,
Wow.
because,
So you turned 20 a few months later,
Yeah.
in October.
Yeah.
Okay. Were you worried or scared at all?
no, I was too young and ignorant.
Okay. All right. Now, when you see these planes these days compared to the B-24 that you flew, are you like,
Oh, yes, definitely. In fact, yesterday we spent several hours at the Airports Museum, and I was amazed at especially the experimental planes that are out there. And of course, I've seen a B-52 up close. And one thing I might mention is in October of 2017, I think it was, there's still a B-24 flying. The Collins Foundation supports B-24, B-17, a B-25, P-51, and I think a P-47. And they go around the country raising funds to support them and also display them. And they travel, you can pick this up on the internet, they travel 10 months out of the year. Each year they publish a schedule where they're going to be and when. And then the other 2 months they spend going over the plane to make sure it's flyable and do any repairs or anything they have to do on it. So in a couple of years ago, when the plane was in Harrisburg, I have a daughter who was in the Army for a while, and a granddaughter who was also in the Army.
go Army?
So the 2 of those and I went up to see this B-24, and they had a deal where for $450 you could fly for a half hour. So all 3 of us went for a flight, a half-hour flight in a B-24. I was right behind the pilot where the radar section was. And
you felt right at home.
yeah. And in order to get in the nose there, you had to go through the bomb bay, into the bomb bay and up. And I have a bad knee here and I can't bend it all the way. And it took 2 guys to put me in the plane because I couldn't climb in there on my own. But we had an interesting flight, and I got a sort of accommodation from the Collins Foundation and all that stuff, you know.
We went and seen them also when they came here to the Wright Field Airport.
Yeah.
So I've definitely seen that a year or 2 ago also. So I know the feeling. It was very exciting, very exhilarating. All right, another question that I had, because you went through a lot of information. You have made this a very easy interview, sir. Thank you for that. The soldier that got shot down after the war, did you know him personally?
Oh, no.
No, okay.
But I've read about it.
Okay. In your downtime over there, if you ever had any, what did you do?
Usually I didn't do anything because they assigned crews to patrol, guard duty for KP. But since I wasn't part of a crew, they very seldom caught up with me.
Out of sight, out of mind.
Because occasionally, some guy in the headquarters and the army, what do we call it, orderly room, would say, hey, this guy hasn't done anything for a while, so let's put him on there. So I would get an assignment occasionally like that, but normally I didn't do anything.
So did you play cards? Did you write letters home? Did you?
Well, on Mordecai, there wasn't any civilians.
Okay.
There was, I think, one native village, and it was beyond the perimeter. And actually, the Army was segregated at that time, and there was a black company on the island that held the perimeter and kept the Japanese up in the hills. And we had an incident with them. Some of our guys in our squadron had a softball team. We was just playing. I was one of it, and one of the guys invited that company to come down and play. And they came down and we had a softball game with them. And unfortunately there was a controversy. And since we had our officials, the game broke up right away. And they jumped in their trucks and went back to the headquarters. But there wasn't any integration at that time at all. You've heard the history of the military service and all that.
I'm aware.
Yeah.
Okay. Are you a part of any veterans organizations now?
Yeah, I belong to the American Legion, and I have a life membership in the Veterans of Foreign Wars, and the Air Force Association. I think I'm not sure whether I'm caught up in dues on the Air Force Association or not, but I'm definitely in the American Legion and the Veterans of Foreign Wars.
Okay. Do you keep up with any of your flying? Do you keep up with any of your flying comrades?
Well, actually, with this reunion here, there's a guy there that I went overseas with, and shortly when I got out of the service, I kept in contact with a couple of guys, and a couple of them died, and then moved down and got married, and we lost contact, but actually haven't caught up with anybody except at these reunions. See a couple of guys.
How often do you come to the reunions?
Lately, we've been having them every year. When I first caught up with them, it was 1998. I saw an announcement in the VFW magazine that they had a reunion plan, so I made a phone call and got connected with that. And I've been to every one since, except one. I think it was 1996. My youngest uncle and his wife were celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary that weekend, and I was invited to their celebration. So I couldn't pass that up to go to a military reunion. So that's the only one I've missed since 1998. And we've been in San Diego a couple of times, in Seattle, San Antonio, Texas, Memphis, Tennessee, and Salt Lake City, and we were in Santa Fe a couple of years ago. So we've been all over the place, and I picked up a lot of friends since then. But now it's mainly children and grandchildren run the organization. Actually, we went out to the cemetery this morning and had a ceremony at the Veterans Cemetery, and I think we had 6 members there. Everybody else was 40 somewhere, children and grandchildren. And of the 6 of us, I think we were all in wheelchairs.
But you're here.
Yeah.
And that's pretty awesome. Okay. Is there anything you feel like we haven't discussed?
Yes. I can't think of what it was now.
Oh.
I thought of it a little while ago. Something I wanted to mention. But now I can't think of it.
Take your time.
Yeah. There was something about flying. Actually, one of the men that's here in this reunion, he was a co-pilot on a couple of missions that I was on over there in wartime. So he's 96 and I'm 93. And we were on a couple of missions. He was a co-pilot. And see, I didn't remember him being on the crew, but I remember I flew with Captain Micus. So I said to him yesterday, I said, do you remember Captain Micus? He said, yeah, I was his co-pilot. I said, well, then we flew together. I was on a couple of missions with him. Another thing that happened over there was kind of unusual. You talked about what I would do instead of a KP or something like that. There was a guy that lived in a tent next to mine that was always on night CQ. And one day he came into my tent and he said, could you do me a favor? I said, what's that? He said, I need a replacement tonight. He said, because I'm down in headquarters all day and they told me to get some rest and get somebody to take my place. And I said, what do you have to do? He said, oh, you just hang around down there in case there's any emergency. And I said, oh, I guess I can do that. At that time, we were showing a movie at night, you know. We had a theater area out in the open. And he said, we'll go to the movies, and then we'll go down and I'll show you what to do. So we get down there. And he said, oh, I forgot to tell you. He said, there's a couple of crews going out in the morning, and you're going to have to drive the pilots down to their planes. And see, what would happen, the enlisted men would get in a truck and go to the plane, and the pilots would go in a Jeep. And he said, you're going to have to drive the Jeep. I said, I don't have a driver's license. He said, do you ever drive a Jeep? I said, yeah, a little bit. And he said, do you ever learn to drive? I said, well, when I was on the farm, I drove a tractor and a truck down there. And he said, do you know how to use a stick shift? And I said, I think so. And there was a Jeep sitting outside. This was about 12 o'clock at night. He said, let's go for a ride. So we went down the road a little ways, shifting gears. He said, you okay? You'll be all right in the morning. So I was worried all night long. And the next morning, I took the Jeep down to headquarters where everybody was loading up, you know. And this Captain Micus was the pilot on that mission. And I said, Captain, how would you like to drive today? He said, it's a good idea. He said, I haven't driven one of the Jeeps for a good while. So I said, that's fine. So I climbed in the back, and he and the other pilots got in, and 3 other pilots. And so he drove down, and I'm happy as a clown, you know. We got down there, and we had to go to the tower to get the weather report so they knew what the weather was. And so we got there, and he said, okay, Sarge, he said, you can drive us to our planes and take the Jeep back. So all I had to do was drive from headquarters to each airplane so they could get to their plane. And then I drove back, and it was a rainy, muddy night, and of course there was no paved roads over there more. I was all through the jungle. So I had a few problems getting back. But I didn't want to get stuck in the mud, because when weather's like that, that's when the Japanese or the enemy tries to infiltrate, you know. So I thought, here I'm going to be in the middle of the jungle all by myself, and the Jeep's stuck in the mud, and the Japs are going to come after me. But I'm sorry, that worked out fine. But I was real happy that Captain Micus was interested in driving the Jeep. Because I didn't want to drive and shift gears and grindy gears and all that. And they'll say, hey, Sergeant, where'd you learn to drive? And I told them I didn't, they'd say, what? So Anyway, there was a few interesting incidents like that. Another thing I might mention, we were coming back from one mission when, as we were in the traffic pattern getting ready to land, three of us were in the waist of the plane, and we're looking down at the ground. We're only about 100 feet above. We saw an ambulance driving down there, and we said, oh, one of the planes must have got hit. And so when we landed, here, when taxied over to park the plane, the ambulance pulled up to our plane. And we said, I wonder who got hit. And what had happened is we had to, see, when the new crew came overseas, they would kind of split them up with an experienced crew for the first couple of flights. And when we went into land and put the landing gear down, there was a kind of a device that slid down and locked the landing gear together. And then from the waist window, you could see that happening on the main gear. But the nose gear, you had to look where the nose gear was in the well underneath the pilot's compartment. And there was a sort of a curtain around that to keep the air out as much as possible. So somebody had to go down and just open the curtain and look in there and see if that was locked down. And this guy, a new flight engineer, I guess he hadn't experienced that before. So they told him to go down and check the nose wheel. And he put his head in that area just when the instruction of the nose wheel came and hit him right in the face. And just messed his face all up, you know. And of course, when we saw him, they put him in the ambulance, taken him to the hospital. And his face was nothing but blood, you know, so we didn't know how bad he was hurt. But he survived, I'm sure, because he was standing up when they put him in the ambulance. But that was interesting to have a guy injured like that in your plane. You didn't know about it until they took him out. So I can't think of much else I could talk about. I'm sure you're going to edit this.
No, I'm not.
You're not?
Mm-mm.
No?
Everything you say is valuable.
Okay.
Okay.
So, let's see. I didn't want to go into my in-laws or anything like that. But, forgot to mention my mother had died when I was 14 years old. She died of cancer. And
So is that why you went to high school somewhere else?
no, that's where I lived with my grandparents
Mm-hmm.
till I finished high school.
Okay.
My
So-
brother and I, he had one more year in high school and I had 3 more. And so we stayed with our grandparents and we worked part-time to do what we could to support, help them, because my grandfather had to retire because he's losing his eyesight. He had, what do you call it when your eyes get to the point where it's no longer glasses, he's not blind, but what, today they gave him an operation for
Glaucoma, cataracts?
that was
Something like that. Yeah, one of those.
yeah.
Okay.
And so they were on sort of a state pension at the time, you know, because of his blindness and also age, because naturally at that time he was in his 70s anyway. And so we stayed there. And when one brother graduated from high school, he went to NYA school, National Youth Administration, a trade school. That's what it amounted to. He learned to weld, and he came to Baltimore eventually as a welder in the shipyards. And then when I was in the service, he turned down deferments because he said, I'm not going to be working here with my younger brother in the Army. So he turned down the deferments, and he ended up in the Navy. And then on the way home from Boca Raton, when I had a 15-day delay, he was at school, Navy school down there in Fort Pierce, Florida, and I stopped to see him for a few hours because he was on mess duty, actually Navy KP duty. So I spent a few hours with him then. Then I got another train up to Pittsburgh. And, you know, we traveled by train then. You never traveled by plane because it was too expensive. Trains were available, you know. So, you want me to continue or you're going? No? Okay.
No, I think we're good.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
That's about all I can say.
All right. So I'm gonna ask you one more question then.
Okay.
All right. What message would you like to leave for future generations that will hear or see this interview?
What's that?
What message would you like to hear, would you like to leave for future generations that will hear or see this interview?
I don't know, just to do the best you can because you never know what's going to happen next. And as they say, take one day at a time, but those days better fit together in some way. And get the best education you can. In my case, the reason I ended up at State Teachers College is because I couldn't afford to go anywhere else, even though I had the GI Bill, because of my situation with my grandparents. And of course, when I was in high school, I had no hopes of going to college. I thought I'd end up working in a coal mine, because in my family, my father's family were all coal miners, my mother's family were all farmers. And so I thought I'd do one of those things, you know, because college costs money, even though at that time you could go to a semester of about $60, I think it was. I'm having trouble because I feel full dentures, and sometimes it's hard to pronounce some of the words. Okay. But anyway, I would like to go into engineering school, and would have better chance of higher salaries than as a teacher. But the one good thing that come out of teaching was a good retirement plan, because it's forever retirement, you know. And then of course where I am now, I'm in this retirement community that's actually run by the Presbyterian Church, and we have independent living, which I'm in now, and assisted living, and then they have health care, and they say that if you run out of money, you won't be put out, because there's a foundation to support those that run out of money. Because it costs me about $2,300 a month. But with my retirement pension and Social Security, I actually make a profit each month, because it costs me normally $2,300 a month to live there. And that includes $300 some for meals during the month and all the utilities except telephone. And of course we have free transportation and so forth. And where I am, we have a valet parking, which means that I can just pull up in front of the building and go in and give the guard my keys and say, park the car and let me know where it is. You know?
Well, that's nice.
And of course,
are they accepting students? No? Okay, I thought I'd ask.
But, yeah, and of course you could pay extra for valet parking too. But the thing is, along with the main building which I'm in, there's several cottages, 2 and 3 bedroom cottages, usually for couples. There's several couples there that are retirement age. They've sold and downsized from their original home to live there, and because they're tired of shoveling snow, cutting grass, and paying utility bills and all that sort of thing, which they don't have to do there. And so that makes it nice. I mean, some people say, oh, I don't want to go to an old man's home. Well, we have a lot of things to do there. We call it Romeo's Club, retired old men eating out. Once a month, they provide the bus service to take us wherever we want to go for lunch. And also recently developed what's called Juliet's. The women, they go out themselves once a month by bus to eat with them. And then usually 2 or 3 nights a week there's outside entertainment. And then every Monday night there's a series of, like a travel series. Wednesday bingo, Friday night bikino, Saturday night movies. So there's always something to do there. And there's a library there, and I have my own computer. Most people have a computer. And so there's never a time when you really don't have anything to do, you know.
So it sounds like you're living your best life.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Yep.
Well, it was definitely a pleasure to meet with you today. And I'm very, very excited that we got to have this long talk, and I really, really appreciate your service that you've done for us, okay? That concludes our interview with John Wright. Thank you for your time today and for your service.